I grew up on Chicago's North Side, Evanston, home of Northwestern University, Skokie, Illinois, target of the Nazi March back in 1977, I believe. I was a tender age of 13. Spoiler alert, I'm a cusp boomer old fart. Also, home of Golf, Illinois. Tiny little bedroom community, appropriately enough, flush with a large golf course near Wilmette, Illinois. A little hamlet of wealth, upper middle class, north side Chicago wealth, largely WASP, maybe even exclusively WASP. I didn't live there. I had several friends who lived there. And I had a girlfriend in high school. She was the daughter of a Northwestern physicist, actually, who worked downstate at Fermilab. Trust me, all of these loose tendrils will come together in this rant. Anyway, my girlfriend, she was very clever, a lot like her dad. She had a cynical sense of humor. And one day I took her to go visit my friends in Gulf, Illinois, and we got lost, which is kind of hard to do because the entire little hamlet with the big homes and sprawling yards, maybe only a few square miles in size. But anyway, we got lost. And when we finally found our way, she said, Gulf, Illinois, a nice place to live, but you wouldn't want to visit. And that was pretty funny. My rant today is why New York City sucks. And I open with memories of growing up on the north side of Chicago and this clever little punny inverted phrase from my girlfriend at the time. Because that's how I see New York City now, having moved the hell out last summer. It's about a year since I've moved from New York City. And I'd say the same thing about New York City. It's a nice place to visit, and I just did about a month ago. But I sure as hell don't want to live there ever again. Hello and welcome to the Bald and Bloviating Podcast. I am your bald and bloviating host, Mookie Spitz, and we're going to be talking exactly about that. Why New York City sucks. Now, before I unload on the Big Apple, which I now consider the rotten apple, let me tell you why I moved there and how I fell in love with it. Because yes, we're talking about a breakup here. And just as with any breakup, you go through a period of courtship, the honeymoon phase, then you live together. Things start to build up to the point you've had enough. And even after you make the decision that you gotta get the hell out of there, there's always gonna be factors making you stay way longer than you should have. And that's exactly the case with my love affair, breakup, and divorce with New York fucking City. I moved to New York around 2011, I believe. I was working in Orange County, California at a digital marketing agency, a digital healthcare marketing agency. I started as a freelance copywriter. I was a little bit like Harry Potter underneath Aunt Petunia's steps. I had a little makeshift desk, and they tucked me literally underneath the stairwell. And I wrote copy for healthcare websites. And then I displayed some competency at that. And I also, in case you haven't noticed yet, have a big mouth. Usually that big mouth gets me into lots of trouble. Subsequently in my career, it's gotten me into lots of trouble. But during my ascent from freelance copywriter to junior copywriter to senior copywriter to digital strategist, all the way up to SVP of strategy, and then managing director of strategy, I've been moving the muscles in my face to express ideas and sell in the resources and services of marketing agencies in that classic Madison Avenue model transposed to the digital world. I've been a digital geek since digital and before digital was cool. I had an Apple IIe computer back in, wow, I must have been 19 years old, so maybe 1983. I programmed interactive fiction games in Pascal. So I was a dork, I was a geek, I continue to be geeky and dorky. I've just published my second novel, which is a science fiction novel. And I went out of my way for the science to be not only accurate, but compelling and creative. So I have embraced technology. I'm the opposite of a Luddite, embraced digital since back then. And I fit into this new model of the new marketing agency in the digital age. It's not only having a big mouth, but being proficient on the digital tools that were busy differentiating brands in the space. I also stumbled into medical editing, which is a whole separate podcast worth of commentary and self-aggrandizement. But suffice to say, I've not only been a tech geek, but I've been a science geek and by extension, a health and medical geek. So I know an awful lot about these things, at least enough to be dangerous and more than enough to edit a book on human fertility for a researcher in Chicago, which ultimately led me to this copywriting job in a healthcare digital agency, and subsequently throughout my career, moving the muscles in my face and talking about and within what I call the convergence of healthcare, communications, and technology. You need to know the science, the clinical research, the data, the human body. You need to know communications, namely this evolving digital madness, to bridge the gap between all that knowledge and science, the clinical trials used to approve FDA-sanctioned drugs. You need to translate all that complicated stuff into a simple story that patients, caregivers, and even doctors can understand. And then you also need to understand the technology that facilitates both the science and the communication. Everything from how they do those clinical trials and the mechanism of action of these drugs to the technology, the evolving technology used to communicate their efficacy and their safety. Anyway, that was my gig. That was my racket. That was my jam back in 2011. The agency that I work with was bought out by a larger national agency. Our little agency of about 120 people was absorbed into a larger countrywide agency with their headquarters in Columbus, Ohio, the heartland. And they were opening a new office in New York City. And the CEO of my smaller agency, based on the success and my ability to sell in our services, not only to the mothership in Columbus, but to new clients in big pharmaceutical companies, healthcare companies along the East Coast, where really the majority of them are HQ'd. Based on all that, they were opening an office in the Trinity building on Broadway, right next to the cemetery, the fabled cemetery where Hamilton and others are buried in downtown Manhattan. They were opening an office, and I was given the opportunity to move from Orange County, California, or Irvine, California, to Manhattan, New York. And I jumped at the opportunity. I was always fascinated by New York City. Throughout my ascent in this digital consumer healthcare marketing world, we had already pitched business on the East Coast, which got me into New York several times. Before then, I had another girlfriend, not the Chicago girlfriend, but a different girlfriend who lived in New York, and I visited her a couple times. This was in the early 90s. And I was fascinated not only by the $18 Caesar salad in Chelsea, but the entire zeitgeist and energy of New York City. Wow. I tend to be a little bit dopamine deprived, as you can probably tell. I like stimulation. I like shaking stuff up. And I will never forget the moment when I came out of Port Authority. I don't remember exactly, but I must have flown into Newark from Chicago back in the day in the early 90s. And I must have taken a bus maybe from Newark to Port Authority. But my first exposure to Manhattan was walking out of the Port Authority bus terminal, which is on 9th Street by 42nd, and feeling that energy. Wow. Every city's got an energy if you tune into it. Washington, D.C. has that bureaucratic energy. Tons of papers being moved around. That's the feeling I get whenever I go to Washington, D.C. Like a busy beaver bureaucrat's office with a hurricane of loose paper flying around an office and people in three-piece suits wrestling on desks. That's the feeling I get about Washington, D.C. The feeling I get about Manhattan to this day is akin to that first feeling I got walking out of Port Authority at 42nd Street onto 9th Avenue. Boom! This manic buzz of energy, and I loved it. Loved it. So that was my memory of Manhattan. I remember rollerblading with this woman and going to see a show. We saw David Mamet's Oleana on Broadway. She knew that I was obsessed with David Mamet, and his most recent play at that time was Oleana, which addressed the battle between the sexes and Me Too before Me Too even happened. Check it out, Oleana. It's a brilliantly written play, if a little bit aloof. And it was really addressing the reverse abuse and discrimination issue. This was brought up again by Michael Crichton. There were many, many extensions of this sensibility, which is how pre-Me Too backfired. And And that play was on Broadway. It was with Treat Williams, and I forget the heroine. It's essentially the teacher and his female student, male teacher, female student, and she got us great seats, and it was the full New York experience. Rollerblading in Battery Park and then going to Broadway to go see this show. Wow. So I loved New York. New York was everything New York purported to be and then some. And then fast forward to my opportunity through work to actually relocate there. So in 2011, I moved my whole family at the time, and that's worthy of several more podcasts. And given my fancy for digression, I'll leave that out of this one. But to suffice to say that we moved to Carl Place, Westbury, Long Island, because the triangulation of all the math and everything we seemed to need set us there. And then I found myself living in Battery Park, then in Brooklyn, then the Lower East Side, and finally the Upper West Side. And throughout my 13 years living in the New York City area, most of which was on Manhattan Island or the close borough of Brooklyn, I got to really explore the city. I had a good friend who was nearly half my age, and we were very fond of city biking, which are those rental bikes that you can get a subscription to on like an annual pass for $150. You could take them out of their cradle using the app, and you get 45 minutes riding time. And then if you check it in and then check out a new bike, you could pretty much ride indefinitely. And these cradles and stations are strategically located throughout Manhattan and its boroughs. And my friend and I would ride all over New York. Huge rides, 8-mile rides, 20-mile rides, all the way from downtown to southern tip of Brooklyn. And Brooklyn is enormous. We rode across the bridge into Queens. We explored north into the Bronx and Harlem. We rode along the West Side Highway. And in addition to this cycling exploration of Manhattan, covering literally hundreds of miles by bike, I had another friend, and he was slightly older than I was, but he was very fit, and we would go jogging or running. I had picked up running, and incrementally I built from running a few blocks to running the New York City Marathon. And we would run 3 miles, 7 miles, 14 miles, 20 miles from the Upper West Side to the Upper East Side, across Manhattan and back again. So on foot, on cycle, I really know New York City, and I would venture to guess that I know New York City better than most New York City residents, especially those born there, where you just take for granted your own neck of the woods. So I did the tourist thing when I first got there as a resident in multiple locations throughout that crazy isthmus of an island, this island that looks like a penis, Manhattan. I really got to know and love. This is important. Remember, this is a romance and a breakup. I got to really, really love that city. And just like a relationship, again, every aspect of New York City that I now hate, I loved. Let me go through the short list. The noise, the crowds, the intensity, the endless restaurants and shows and art. That energy blast I felt walking out of Port Authority was just the zeitgeist that I ate up. Loved it, loved it, loved it. Also, living in Manhattan, it proved its economic purpose that although the cost of living is outrageous and arguably second only in expense and unlivability to San Francisco, Manhattan proved to be expeditious for my career. I was the Grand Master Digital Strategist Healthcare Bloviator. So there were conferences and networking events. All the thought leaders in my industry came in and out of Manhattan. Some of them lived there or in the boroughs. And me living in the boroughs and then in Manhattan, people would come to me. I became, for a while, the Yoda, or at least one of the Yodas, of healthcare digital communication. I wrote for PharmaForum, which was an evolving and wonderful platform for all things pharmaceutical marketing and clinical science. Great editor Paul Tunna, who basically built it from scratch. He gave me a great opportunity to write a monthly column on this evolving mobile health technology. And then I wrote for other publications, and people would come into the city and I would hang out with them. We would go to the Oyster Bar in Grand Central Station and browse in the Apple Store. We would go to the Oculus, that wonderful, bizarre structure that looked either like a dinosaur fossil or some alien landing craft. We would hang out in Central Park. So I was New York, and New York was me, and I loved it. So then the next logical question, if you've been tracking this far, is what the hell happened? Did New York have an affair? Did New York say something to really trigger me? Well, there were two changes. I think just like in a relationship, it's not a single event that sours you to your mate. And typically the changes are happening bilaterally, if you will. Your mate is going through changes, and you're going through changes, and your relationship, well, it wasn't quite how it started. Now, is it? And that's what happened to me and New York City. Let me first tell you how I changed. So, over the course of the last 2-3 years, I started shifting my energy from this Yoda of healthcare digital communications career to starving artist. Now, starving is a relative term. And when you look at the logarithmic scale from Bangladesh untouchable to Jeff Bezos, it's quite a range. And I've remarked in prior podcasts, and I even mention it in my new novel, in a funny digression, that I see happiness on a logarithmic scale and wealth on a logarithmic scale. So if you are comparing me to a Bangladesh beggar and Jeff Bezos, I'm probably closer to Jeff Bezos than the beggar, and likely even like an 8 or 9 in the broad scheme of things. Simply having a flush toilet will already put you at least at a 7. So that all said, when I say starving artist, it's relative. But I definitely shifted my energy and time and focus in a zero-sum kind of way from my work. as an independent consultant by this point to creative writing. And this specifically was collaborating with an illustrator friend of mine on a book called Super Santa and blogging like a maniac and just pounding the shit out of my Amazon Basics keyboard and living the life of a writer, living the life of the kind of person I always wanted to be when I was younger, but for one reason, then another, I bounced back and forth between writing all the time creatively and then not so much. And then when I became an accidental yet eager and excited father, everything switched into refocusing my existence onto a professional career that could support a family. And about 2-3 years ago, my oldest son was gaining his own independence off to college. And during this 2-3 year time, he has since joined the Marines and is now a Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton. And my younger son is taking a gap year between college and his high school years and is working. And I am even more obsessed with my creativity. And speaking of starving, I am even more irresponsible financially. So I've gone from very comfortable, what would be considered middle class or even lower middle class Manhattanite, making 300 grand a year in Manhattan, folks, is lower middle class. And that is a fact. So I've gone from that to not that, suffice to say. And all because I want to be a writer. I want to be a podcaster. I want to be a blogger. I want to be a ranter on social media. And that's what I'm doing. And it's cost me money. It's likely cost me relationships because I have changed my lifestyle from someone who can have the financial fluidity to take that trip spontaneously or go to that fancy restaurant and maintain a lifestyle, which, as I'm saying, is lower middle class, maybe middle class New York, to somebody who's pounding on an Amazon Basics keyboard and barely making enough money to keep himself and his dependents afloat. So that's the transformation that has occurred with me in my life. And this might enable you to better understand why I fell out of love with New York City. So, like any relationship, I am not blaming my partner, New York City, entirely. I am taking ownership of my side of this disintegrated romance with the Big Apple. And my side of this, again, just to summarize, is a shifting from an extroverted, big agency, corporate type mofo, making enough money to maybe not save a penny, but indulge in everything that New York had to offer. Shows, movies, restaurants, travel, hotels, etc., etc., to this guy writing books and blogging, and then soon ranting on video, and eventually podcasting. Here I am. I bloviate, therefore I am. To be continued. So that's me. Now you can see where I'm going with this. What are the charms of New York City? Why is New York City deservedly acclaimed as one of the greatest cities on earth? Go to shows, the best shows on the planet, Broadway, movie premieres, five-star restaurants showcasing culinary greatness and talent, the world's greatest museums, etc., etc. I had personally reached the point where I did not give a shit. And part of that had to do with an indulgence, arguably an overindulgence. I had a whirlwind romance for maybe about a year and a half, where we were out constantly, every show, every music concert that interested in us, every weekend. Bada bing, bada boom, living large in Manhattan. Woo! Now, that was great. I loved it, but I had reached the point of bastante. Enough was enough. Enough was enough with the relationship, which could be several more podcasts and probably will be. Several more characters in my evolving science fiction novel series to be continued. But once again, vis-a-vis my breakup, not with her, but with New York, I was over it. So what's the next step of that? When the advantages of a relationship or a city start to vanish, for example, in a relationship, if you're not having sex or good sex and you're no longer courteous to each other and it's no longer fun to hang out, then the sacrifices that you make to sustain that relationship all of a sudden become unbearable. And that's what happened to me, folks. Bastante, enough. Now, just as I have, with all objectivity and fairness, listed what makes New York great, here's what sucked about it: the noise, the traffic, the smells. Let's start with that. Simply to get from Penn Station to Grand Central, which is intuitive enough and obvious enough, you need to linebacker your way through crowds, through a subway system that was designed for 1/10, 1/20th the volume of commuters. It's hot, it's smelly. The homeless problem is a problem. Snapshot. By the time I moved to the Upper West Side and I'm beginning this transition from agency Yoda to reclusive author, I was spending $5,500 a month on a dump. The doorknobs were falling off, the plywood doors. It was infested by rodents and bugs. The insulation was virtually non-existent, so we would freeze our ass off in the winter and burn up in the summer. And I lived around 98th Street and Broadway, more or less. And every morning, waking up in my $5,500 a month dump, I would hear right outside my window, got a dollar, got a dollar, got a dollar. Now, in that area, that classic Upper West Side neighborhood, gorgeous architecture, folks, tree-lined promenades, was embedded subsidized housing. So what did that amount to? I am just talking about my lived experience. I'm not talking politics. Based on my lived experience, there were homeless people sleeping on my stoop. I woke up every morning to got a dollar. I had a relationship just down the street at 92nd and Broadway. And whenever I would go visit her down Broadway or down Amsterdam, it was quite an adventure negotiating myself through shambling homeless people, threatening gangbanger type youth, and it was not pleasant. Now, before you dismiss me as a right-wing maniac or make all sorts of judgments on how I am projecting the white man's burden with this rant, I want to repeat, this is not a political statement, and it's not saying anything about anything except how much I came to fucking hate New York City. I am paying an exorbitant rent for $5,500. That's like the mortgage on a Victorian mansion with 10 acres of land outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Get the fuck out of here with this. And my point here is that New Yorkers are used to it, and they think that's okay. And now the Democrats, speaking of politics, have voted in somebody, at least in the primary, whose pitch was to make housing more affordable. Does that mean more subsidized housing? Who is representing whom? And what constitutes a quality of life that's equitable and fair and safe, not just for the middle class, but honestly for everyone else? What does it serve people to live in a neighborhood like that? So this, among many other gripes, made me come to despise New York City. Enough was enough. And we could blame Robert Moses for this, deliberately creating a restrictive infrastructure to preclude diversity and force economic disparity and income equality and keep the races segregated. And you would probably be right. But here's the grand irony as I shift for a moment into politics, which is, how can we find a balance in our increasingly polarized political and social environment where we could create a good quality of life for everyone according to their means and based on their preferences? And I'm not solving this problem, and I hope I'm not exacerbating it by complaining about it, but come on. New York, to me, New York City had become unlivable. Why? Because I was no longer getting its many, many benefits, which I acknowledge here, and I was paying the stiff price of a failed approach to urban management and this bankrupt attitude toward what constitutes a high quality of life. The evidence of one's senses is the evidence of one's senses. And I still have great friends in New York, and I'm still friends with the woman at 92nd and Broadway, who's a lovely, charming, sweet, professional lady. And we talk about this. She'll text me from the subway and acquiesce to the fact that it smells like piss down there. Is that the way to live? And I recently went back to New York City to visit. I had a client meeting. Yes, I still have clients. And then I met with my client, and I'm looking around, and it confirms everything that I'm ranting about here. And it's only gotten worse, I think. So going back to the politics, hello, Democrats. I'm a Democrat. I mean, ideally, I'm a libertarian, but when it comes down to the simple fact that we're in a binary political system and I've got to vote one way or another, I was the one blogging hoping that Kamala would win. But when a city like New York City seems to be falling apart at the seams, then you have to wonder if that's the approach you want to take to win elections. Asking for a friend. Moby wrote a wonderful essay, and this goes back quite some time, maybe even 10 years, maybe more than that. He is the underground DJ who became a songwriter, and he always exemplified that alternative music scene, spinning the records, being at the heart of a rave, and living that life. And his essay nailed everything wrong with New York going back more than a decade. And there's an odd inversion here where he grew up pre-Giuliani and he flourished pre-Giuliani when it was literally dangerous to walk in Times Square, and no one in their right mind would even think about entering Central Park after dusk. So Moby's New York was dangerous and filthy and had soul and style and angst and was affordable and it had character. And Moby left when the character left the city, where in exchange for the Giuliani cleanup and for the gentrification of the whole damn town, it no longer had that character and it got expensive. And Moby's sitting there in a basement spinning his vinyl to a bunch of yuppie brats. And he's thinking to himself, I gotta get the fuck out of here. And he ended up moving to LA. And fast forward, there's a certain irony in my already genteel, lower middle class, white boy self looking at that Manhattan that Moby left over a decade ago and complaining about it almost through the looking glass. That what I found was a rough and tumble New York, like a marbleized New York, where it had the seedier elements, but with none of the character and none of the benefit, where income disparity had accelerated and the gap was even wider, where it was the shittiest aspects of both, where you had the physical danger and that sense of depravity without any character or benefit, and you had the elitist assholes indulging themselves at everyone else's expense and wringing the entire city devoid of any redeeming quality except for avarice and this snobby, shitty condescension. And that sounds harsh, but I'm going to stick to it. I think New York City sucks. And I'm trying to acknowledge it through the lens of my own introspection and my own shift into what ostensibly is a fuddy-duddy old fart. But New York let me down, and I let New York down. Again, just like a relationship. And I am hard-pressed to understand, comprehend how Many of the folks that I'm still in touch with and still love, still consider my good friends, are living there. And to me, they just seem like that's home and they're dealing with it. It's 95 degrees this week, and I can't even imagine what that shithole subway experience is like. Or linebackering your way through Grand Central Station during rush hour. No, thank you. And that all said, going full circle to the beginning of this rant, sure, if my client asks me for another meeting next month, I'll get on that plane and I'll go to New York. And I'll enjoy an Uber arriving within 5 seconds of summoning it on the app. And if I could squeeze in a Broadway show, I would love to. Glengarry Glen Ross remake with Bill Burr was about to open when I was there, let alone a host of amazing talent on full display. Nothing like it in the whole world. Or taking a walk in the village and discovering a new band or artist I've never heard of. But when it comes down to sitting in a restaurant and screaming at each other, paying $30 for a salad and $20 for a cocktail, and then plowing out of the restaurant at 1 a.m, the bar, and stumbling into a mound of garbage because there are no alleys and they still haven't fucking figured out how to throw shit out. No, thank you. And rather than end this rant with all of this negativity, I think that this is an opportunity because I'm not the only one who's gotten the fuck out of New York City. I came here to California and I celebrated for weeks that I have a washer and dryer in my goddamn apartment. Having enough square footage that you don't fall all over the refrigerator is a major plus. Droves of people across all age groups, especially young people, have gotten the hell out of New York City. They're moving to Florida, to Texas, to flyover country. And the reason they're doing it is because work has gotten virtual. One of the silver linings of the pandemic, and they're able to pretty much work from everywhere, the digital nomad. And they're leaving because they want to actually not spend 85% of their salary on the goddamn rent. And they themselves, even the young people, the up and comers, are realizing it's just not worth it. It's not worth it to die of asphyxiation on your way to go see the Rockets at Radio City Music Hall. And they too realized that they could come and visit and then get the fuck out of New York City. So I bring all of this up because I feel like it, and I'm getting this off my chest. But I'm also bringing this up because I think it's a message to New York City. Back to the politics. Do you want to go to a liberal progressive? You want to bring back Cuomo? I don't know, man. I think I would have voted for him had I been there. How's that for damning myself forever in the eyes of the progressive left? But is your dream New York mine? And most significantly, is your dream New York realistic based on what New York has become and what it risks becoming? And what kind of New York do New Yorkers want? All of them. I'm not one to say I left, but I'm saying this because this is an opportunity for New York to transform itself. You've gone from the hippest, coolest town with spicy danger and an Armageddon-like edge to a bougie, gentrified mess of a mix where nobody is happy. Now what? Who owns New York? Who is entitled to New York? What could or should New York be? And maybe even more importantly, how does New York City reflect how we see ourselves as a country? Who we want to lead us and how we want to live? What's happened to New York City? Is it happening to the rest of the country slowly and surely? Or is this backlash to the backlash to the backlash a consequence of New York City going into the dumpster of inequality, polarization, and extremes? Because I'm sure the residents at the top of that Needle high rise overlooking Central Park, where a 2-bedroom apartment is $300 million, I don't think they give a shit about my rant, but I would bet the rest of the city beneath them certainly does. And thank you for listening. And I'd love to hear back from you. Either way, that I've channeled your own anger and contempt for the greatest city on the planet going to hell, or throw it back in my face and say I'm completely missing the point. And in my old fuddy-duddy years, I've just turned into the stereotypical archetypal old grandpa. But I'm happy. I feel good. And you know what makes me feel really great? Bloviating on these podcasts, writing my books, going into debt, celebrating my creativity, letting it all out, and hating on New York fucking City. Thanks for listening to the Bald and Bloviating podcast, and lots more bloviation to come.